Please share your thoughts on youth incarceration rates.
Well, I think youth incarceration rates are actually the new Jim Crow. And there's a very profound book that defines that. But it anybody who's got a little bit of drive and refuses to sit still in school is likely to get put out. And once they get put out of school, they're almost scheduled to end up in prison. I got kicked out of school in third grade. And the boy that I got kicked out of school with, I never saw again until I was going into my senior year in college. And he came to the swimming pool where I was lifeguard and almost drowned because he was high on heroin. And he reminded me, we got expelled together at Bellina C. Jones School, Miss Sarah Vokeland's classroom. And I said, oh gosh, I had forgotten that. He couldn't forget it because that was the last day he'd been in school, third grade. And I said, where have you been? And he said that he'd been in and out of just about every prison in Louisiana. And he said, what about you? And I said, well, I've been in college, but I'm not doing well. I don't know what I want to do. I'm thinking about dropping out and joining the Army. He cussed me out in no uncertain terms about I better not waste this opportunity, that I had to do something to make, he said, I'm just as smart as you. And he didn't have to tell me that, because if he'd survived the prison system in Louisiana while I was flunking out of college, he was obviously smarter. But it made me go back to school, and it made me never forget that there but for the grace of God go I. My mother was a teacher. My father was a dentist. They got me back in school the next day. His mother was a domestic worker who made $1 a day plus car fare. She couldn't take time off to get him back in school. So he never got back in school. And I think for me, that's always been a parable, because I was about 6 years old when that happened. And, you know, we have to give people a chance. And what I know now is that everything that made me a rambunctious student and that got me put out, that wasn't the only time I got put out of school. But all of the attention deficit disorder, when I became mayor, they call that multitasking. And if I couldn't do 5 or 6 things at one time, I wouldn't have been a good mayor, or I couldn't have worked with Martin Luther King. So boys were not meant to sit still in school and have somebody pour into them information. So incarceration starts with the failures of our ability to educate young men. If we find ways to educate young boys, we find that all of that energy and aggressiveness that ends up making them criminals will make them creative leaders and responsible citizens in another world, in a new world.
Please share your thoughts on the role of the community in reducing youth incarceration.
Well, I think, first of all, the community has got to stop being afraid of its young people. And because their hair's all wild and they walk in with their pants halfway down, trying to be, well, actually, they have taken the prison culture to the streets. And they don't tie their tennis shoes. And the reason you don't tie your tennis shoes is they don't give you shoestrings in prison. They don't let you wear a belt in prison because you might hang yourself. So they've taken the prison culture and made it the youth culture of our time. And I think instead of fighting with them about pulling your pants up, I think we need to educate them on the origins of that kind of behavior. And we've got to give them other alternatives. Now, the best people to do that are people who have been in prison. And I think that I would love to have a group of ex-convicts who got educated in prison and who came out and got teacher certificates and master's degrees. I would love to see a few of them in some of our schools. But most of all, I think the group I look to for the most hope is the military. I spoke for a group of sergeants down at Fort Benning, and there were 2,000 young men and women between the ages of 19 and 25. And I said, if I could just have you 2,000 with a teaching certificate and the basic training and ranger training and military discipline that required you to be sergeants, and if I could put 2 or 3 of you all in every school in Georgia, we could solve our education problems. So I encourage people in the military to get a teaching certificate before they come out and come back to our small towns and our inner cities and be teachers.
And lastly, what policy changes would you like to see to reduce the high rates of incarcerated?
I think when we put in the 3 strikes you're out, the 2 strikes you're out, the mandatory minimum sentences, we built a trap for ourselves. And I think even our Republican governor is saying that this doesn't make sense. It's too expensive to spend $40,000 to keep somebody in prison when you could send them to college at one of our metropolitan colleges for $1,000 a year. It's not good business, it's not good politics, it's certainly not good religion, and it's not good sense.
That is all we have. Thanks to youth incarceration.
Well, when you say policy to reduce youth incarceration, the first thing that comes to mind is there must be a greater focus on educational retention in school of young people, particularly in this state where you may have 50% of youth, particularly minority youth, males not graduating from high school. There must be some type of focus on retaining and getting the attention of Black, Latino males very early on to keep them in school, because the vast majority of individuals who are incarcerated have not graduated from high school.
How can we overcome the barriers in employment for young men of color?
Barriers of employment, particularly for young men of color, is something that must be looked at in terms of culture and values within society. Have we come to a point where incarceration in and of itself becomes, let's say, a measure in terms of whether someone can reintegrate back into society fully? So we really have to look at what it means to have been incarcerated. Does this mean that an individual will never be able to get the type of life-sustaining positions that is needed to survive in the society? And if that's the case, we have to seriously consider whether or not barriers to employment based upon incarceration should be something that we continue in this society.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
People of goodwill, political figures, as well as business leaders will have to come together to address this issue collectively, to say that this is something we have to change in order to sustain ourselves in the future, because with high rates of incarcerations, individuals not being able to find suitable employment, we can eventually become a society to where there are so many people unable to contribute to the tax base. It's going to be detrimental to the economy.
Well, personally, I think starting in school, it would help if the differentiated learning styles, I think, is one of the things that begins the process when, as a substitute teacher part-time, I find that going into some of the schools, things are so antiquated in that a lot of the educators, I feel, have not mastered that, where you have auditory or kinesthetic types of learning styles that are not addressed, where students become frustrated oftentimes, and when they become of age, they drop out, hence starting that process of not feeling connected to the education and well-being of society, and then start doing criminal activities. As it's been proven that oftentimes if you're not educated, you end up in that system.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
Well, again, I think one thing would be to exposure. One great book of mine that I like is called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about having exposure in no matter what culture or society that you live in goes a long way in getting kids involved. While in the nonprofit organization that I started, Mentoring Partnerships to Address Challenged Teens, trying to get as much exposure through education and the business community, whether it's the local guy on the community in the community with the car wash, doctors, lawyers, whomever, just to give them that type of exposure and find out what it is that they possibly want to do in life. I think helps greatly.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
I think that strategy, again, would go back to the education and economic aspect of it, because when a person feels good about themselves through their education and they have employment, are gainfully employed, they tend to, hold their heads up higher and do things that are rewarding and also giving back to the community, to those that help them succeed in those areas.
In our counseling center, we work with a lot of adolescents that are having different types of problems, whether it's alcohol or drugs or gangs or some previous involvement with juvenile justice. All of this also affect their educational approaches. And what we try to do is we try to take this youth and help them understand that whatever actions they're taking today at age 13, 14, and so on, it's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. We also try to help them understand that it's okay if you've made a mistake. You will have opportunities to correct those mistakes and to move on with your life. So we help children who are coming out of the youth centers or who have previously been incarcerated, but we're actually now trying to help youth before they get in trouble that is going to cause incarceration.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
Well, I believe that we are very quick to send kids to jail. We should not be able, or we should not be handcuffing children at 8, 9, 10 years old. This is something that is traumatic and is something that is not necessary in most of the cases that we come across. So I would begin by asking, why are we incarcerating children? So what we're getting is we're having youth incarcerated because of things like truancy or shoplifting, or the most common for the kids we work with is substance use or possession of marijuana. So these are parts that unfortunately are the reality of many of these youth communities. By incarcerating youth with these issues without finding out why they're participating in those behaviors, I think is the biggest issue that we need to address. We get youth sent to us who are failing school, who are joining gangs, who are using drugs, and the underlying reason that that's happening is because of some kind of trauma, some kind of family conflict, or some kind of unresolved situation that nobody's taking the time to address. Something that could be a very quick fix, but instead we just want them out of the classroom, we want to lock them up so that they don't bother anyone else. And what we're getting in return is we're getting a youth, an innocent youth, who is being sent into an environment where when they come out, they're very different youth. And once you lose that innocence, it's very, very hard, maybe even impossible, to get back.
How important is education in addressing substance abuse, the substance abuse issue that contributes to the incarceration of young men of color?
Education is community-wide. So, for example, we have several campaigns to address underage drinking. Our biggest epidemic is prescription drug abuse. So we have campaigned to address that. Where we fail is sometimes we don't teach the parents how to support their children's decision to remain drug-free. We also need to educate the parents that alcohol is just as strong as a weapon and needs to be under lock and key. The same thing with prescription medication. They need to be under lock and key. What happens is we're having youth today that they don't need fake IDs. They get alcohol and drugs right at home, at your home or at your friends' homes. So education is a community issue. We need to continue to educate the liquor store shop owners, the gas stations and grocery stores as to how not to sell alcohol to children. We need to teach parents how not to promote or host drinking parties for underage kids. And we need to educate the youth themselves. Now, where we need to educate the youth, my belief and what we started doing is as early as age 5. As soon as they begin elementary school, kids need to learn that alcohol and drugs are dangerous, and they need to know why they're dangerous. And as the kids get older and we start getting into the development of the brain, they will begin to understand that their consumption of alcohol or drugs at an early age is going to affect the development of that brain.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
The community that we work with is largely an immigrant community. We are serving people that come from all over Latin America. Georgia has physical representation of all 22 Spanish-speaking countries in the world. We have to make sure that before we enter those communities, that we have the right information that is culturally and linguistically appropriate for that community. So it is not a matter of just translating a brochure. It's a matter of going into those communities, learning from them what their specific needs are for us to be able to provide the information that they're going to need to have the buy-in that they're going to need. So we've been successful in doing that. We had an underage drinking forum for Spanish-speaking parents. We had over 100 parents show up at our forum. And this is not because we have any magic. It's the same information that is being provided in English all over the United States. But the way it's delivered and the way that we invited those families was a culturally and linguistically appropriate way. So we have to continue to learn about these communities. They teach us every day. We also need to understand that these communities are hungry for knowledge. They're afraid, especially if they don't know how the general system works in the United States. So they need a little more hand-holding than the general population in order to say, okay, I want to be a part of that.
Thank you. Incarceration.
Well, youth incarceration. First of all, in the state of Georgia, if we're talking about youth as defined by a juvenile code, you're talking about folks under 17. At our office at the Georgia Justice Project, we deal with kids who are charged with crimes under 17. And we also deal with youth who are over 17. Often, most folks often think of youth as older, which is okay. So how we deal with the problem, or how I define the problem, is often in juvenile courts. Our experience in juvenile courts, I should say my experience in juvenile courts as our organization, is that the courts, as you know, are focused in juvenile court, are focused on the best interest of the kid. So a kid does something wrong, whether small, selling drugs, having drugs, stealing something, or even getting in a fight or what have you, the focus of the court is to really get that kid back to the best place. Our experience is that when you address the needs of that client, the needs of the kid, and our office does that because we have social workers on our staff and we stay with our folks, is that the courts really respect that approach. And the courts are interested in that approach. They're set up to deal with those underlying issues that led to that kid making a mistake. Unfortunately, many of the systems, the court systems here in Georgia and probably around the country, are ill-equipped. They just are underfunded to really have enough staff and support to have an intervention for that kid. So the main intervention is that kid getting arrested. The main intervention is him coming to court or her coming to court, and having a probation officer has too many cases and hopefully will check in on that kid. So often what we see is what's needed and what the courts are open to is that sort of intervention, but it doesn't often happen. Now we'll say I believe it happens in our office, but we're set up to do things differently. And if there were more systems, probably like ours, if there were more systems, if these courts had more resources to be able to offer interventions and support, I believe that would significantly reduce the number of folks going into prison in the juvenile prison system. And I believe that's what the new juvenile code in Georgia really is set up to do. Let me stop for a second. Is that responsive to your question? I'm really describing more of the problem than I'm giving you an answer.
No, I think it was
But
great.
if you want to, because we also had noise, it was.
Okay, all right. I
Okay.
keep wanting to cross my legs, but.
So I mean, if you want to just,
Yeah,
bring it down just
Yeah,
a little tighter.
I'm sorry. I feel like I'm giving more of a background than I am giving you. Please ask your question again.
Okay.
So-
In your professional role, how do you address the issue of youth incarceration?
So the way we address in our professional role at the Georgia Justice Project, youth incarceration, is that when we represent a juvenile in the juvenile system in Georgia, because of our approach, because we have a holistic approach, we are a nonprofit law firm basically that has social workers. We don't charge our clients, we don't take government money, and we select our clients based on community referrals. But when we get involved with a young person or a client, our social workers are involved as well. And the idea is to address what got them there in the first place. In other words, why are you here? What mistakes did you make? What choices were you making? Where are you in your life? And then how can we help you correct that? And we do that from the side of being their lawyer and being their social worker, who aren't paid by the government. We aren't there because the court said us to be there. Well, I'll just give you one quick example. I was in court a number of years ago with a young guy who was charged, first-time offense, 13 years old, in burglary. And he had been met with one of our law students. He had met with one of my social workers, and this is the first court date, which comes up pretty quick in juvenile court. And I went in to meet with him, and I asked him, why am I here? And he looked at me and didn't say a word. I said, am I here because the court told me to be here? He said, no. I said, am I here because the judge told me to be here? He said, no. I said, am I here? We said, why do you think I'm here? He said, because the pastor called you. I said, yeah, the pastor called me about your case, but do I work for the pastor? Hoping he'd figure that out, and he did. He says, no. I said, so why do you think I'm here? And he had some sense, right, that it wasn't just I was there as a lawyer, but the social worker was there, and we'd been involved, and we're about to walk in for the first hearing. He looked at me, and he said, you're here because you care about me. And I said, that's exactly right. I said, because we have the choice in who we represent and how we approach it. And so often these systems they assign these services, and the services are aligned essentially with the person with the gun who's in the court, the person who has the handcuffs behind their back. If the kid doesn't do what they're told to do, and I've been in many courts where judges say this, and they do, you do it or you're going to jail. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe that that's the best approach to redemption and to get somebody on the path to solving their own problems. I mean, I believe the person has to own them on their own, and that we can support that together. Because at our office, at the Georgia Justice Project, and the role that often defense lawyers have is being on the side of the client and using that as leverage to encourage a client to move in the right direction. So, and I believe too that, of course, courts respond to that. We rarely have courts give us pushback when we're able to demonstrate that approach. So that's what I think is an effective response professionally to the juvenile justice incarceration issue. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that
Yes,
was-
that was awesome.
Sorry.
Secondly, what do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
What is it? Policy. I'll go with policy for 200, Alex. Well, on this issue, what is the top policy consideration or change to reduce youth incarceration? Here, I think mandatory minimums are an issue. In Georgia, the mandatory minimum issue shows up for young folks, sadly and most strenuously or heinously, with the SB 440 legislation. And everybody refers to it as SB 440, Senate Bill 440, which requires juveniles under the age of 17 who are charged with a handful of things to be prosecuted as adults. And each of those charges also carry a mandatory minimum. So not only does that law require that kid who's 13 to 17 to go to adult court, and most prosecutors and judges feel they have very little discretion to not do it, or they rarely take advantage of their discretion to do it. But on top of that, if they get into adult court and that young person is in fact guilty or they can be found guilty, they are looking at a mandatory 10, 20 years in prison, or possibly life. So from a policy perspective, we see a lot of young folks, and we fight hard to keep that from happening for the individual cases we work on. But from a policy perspective, I believe the state of Georgia in particular could do a lot of reducing its cost of incarceration, of really giving a kid a second chance who's maybe made a mistake by not having those mandatory minimums, particularly, for instance, for armed robbery, which is the way we see this a lot, and those in the system see it. To give that kid a second chance, or to really give the prosecutor or judge more discretion, to give a judge more discretion to make a decision not to send that kid to prison for 10 or 20 years. So I believe that there's the lack of discretion, the SB 440 statute in particular, sort of has placed a pretty difficult burden on the youth population who are charged like that and enter the adult system.
As I think about youth incarceration and the top policy or initiative that could change that, the statistics around that, I would say that first and foremost, we have to increase the level of accountability within our education system. We talk about accountability a lot in education, but it's typically really with respect to individual test scores in an individual school year. The reality is an individual test score is not going to change the life trajectory of a child. And so to the extent that we can get educators focused on the long-term impact of the work that they're having, I think that ultimately means that we're taking a longer-term view of the work that's happening in a classroom. And so what I mean by that, if you were to ask the high school down the street, how many of your kids graduated from college? The reality is 4 years later, they couldn't tell you because we don't have tracking mechanisms in place to really determine what happens to a kid after they leave the K-12 system. So if we don't even have systems in place to track students long-term, there's no way we can hold ourselves accountable to a higher bar. I work for an organization that's focused on getting kids to and through college, and we hold ourselves to a high level of expectation. It's not just about our high school graduation rate for us. It's about getting kids to college, but ultimately we hold ourselves to the bar of how many of our kids actually graduate from college. And for us, that's an indicator of did we prepare them well academically? Did we instill the character strengths they need to be successful in school? Did we provide them with the right supports, the financial supports, the wraparound services that are going to ensure that they ultimately complete? Because we know that a college degree is ultimately what's going to put them on a different life trajectory and allow them to break the cycle of poverty that often exists in our community. So if we think about that with respect to incarceration, I think it's the same idea. You can track what percentage of kids coming from a particular school system, particular school, are getting incarcerated, and really begin to look at that data and start to track backwards and see what indicators did we see? What did we see in kindergarten? What did we see in middle school? What did we see in high school that would have led us to understand that a kid was on a path towards incarceration? And I think if we start to unpack that data, you'll see that there's actually a lot you could learn from that.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
There's probably lots of best practices to reduce youth incarceration. I come at this from the perspective of an educator, having been a principal, having been a teacher, and now an executive director over a network of schools. What I see ultimately that has the greatest impact on decisions that youth make, it's all about the peer groups that they select. And so from my perspective, schools that get it right create a culture within the atmosphere and the four walls of that school of positive peer pressure where it's cool to learn. It's expected that you do your homework. It's expected that you're going to college. The adults in the building can create that culture. And it can become an oasis for students. I think we've had success in the KIPP network of keeping kids in school for longer hours. So our kids come to school from 7:30 till 5. They're in school on Saturdays. They have extra time in the summer. And increasing the amount of time they're in school and a culture of positivity, a culture of high expectations for kids, a positive peer pressure culture reduces the chances that kids are out on the street, that they're getting involved in gangs, that they're getting involved in activities that are ultimately going to result in incarceration.
And lastly, what strategy would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
You know, I think the community in many cases has given up on kids. You look down the street and you watch kids walking down the street. We make assumptions about students. We make assumptions about kids that they're on a certain path based upon their background. And the reality is there's never been a more important time for our community to engage. And there's lots of ways that they can do that, from the simple things of, you know, you see a kid on the street who's doing something he shouldn't be doing, call him out on it. Kids still respect authority if you demand that respect. But perhaps more importantly, get engaged in your local school. Our kids need mentors, and especially our young guys need male mentors in their lives. There's tons of positive role models doing great things in our community. Our kids don't see enough examples of that. And so to the extent that we can showcase success for them, demonstrate for them that with hard work, you can put yourself on a different path. For many of our kids, what they see is the quickest way to money is doing illegal activity. We need to show them there's a longer term vision for this, that invest in your education and you actually live a much more comfortable lifestyle long term.
Thank you, Mr. Jernigan.
Thank you.
Public health issue.
Well, you know, incarceration is a public health issue because of the disparity in health outcomes that people who go behind the walls have. More mental health problems, more substance use problems, more problems with chronic disease. That's called population health, and that means why mental health, public health is being part of the process.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
I think we need to focus a lot more on our youth, and if I could pick one thing, it would be early childhood education. We know that getting kids educated early gets them well educated as well as identifies health problems.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
Engaging communities early is very important, and trying to get those communities to look at diversion programs as a best practice versus putting people behind the walls.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
I think the most important thing that we can do to communities to get mobilized to reduce mass incarceration is to make sure that people know that mass incarceration is preventable and that they can do something about it and it's not hopeless.
In my professional role as Director of Community Voices, I address youth incarceration in a matter of ways. We address it from the policy side by looking at different policies we can advocate for and assist communities in advocating for to reduce youth incarceration, to improve educational opportunities, and also to do outreach into communities about the importance of family engagement to prevent individuals from going to prison. And also on the programmatic side, we run a host of programs, including the PATH Project, which is targeting African American and Latino youth between the ages of 14 and 24 who've had some sort of interaction with the criminal justice system. And we try to develop life skills with them, teach them about positive socialization, and also make certain that we're creating communities that are ready to accept them as who they are and help them thrive in the future.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
I think the number one thing we can do to reduce youth incarceration has to be to invest more in primary education. By investing in education, educational opportunities, we ensure that individuals can perhaps have better economic opportunities in the future and prevent the chances for them to go to prison. A second thing I think we can do is look at diversionary programs. So many times we see youth who made a mistake who get sentenced to crimes that end up, sentenced for crimes that end up, can I start over?
Sure.
Okay. Ask me the question again.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
I think one of the top policy changes that can be made to reduce youth incarceration has to be reducing sentencing for youth violence. I think that it's an opportunity that we have as citizens to say there may be a child who's had some difficulties in school, perhaps difficulties at home, and instead of sending them into a correctional system, we can have a diversionary program where they can be treated in a community setting. By preventing those youth from entering the correctional system, we're reducing the likelihood that they'll return as adults.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
I think there's several best practices to reduce youth incarceration, and Community Voices has really been a leader in reducing incarceration among all age groups. One of the things that I think we do well is look at the whole family. We have fatherhood initiatives through our Mila program. Mila stands for Romula, the Nigerian god of passion. And what we really think is compassion is necessary when we're working in this community. So we work with fathers who have been previously incarcerated and teach them how they can work with their children to keep them from repeating their same mistakes. We also work in the community settings with social organizations to teach them how to make sure there are job readiness skills available to people returning home, or returning citizens as we're now calling them. So I think combining the family approach with the policy approach with the connections to community organizations, we can reduce incarceration rates.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this issue?
I think the number one thing we can do to engage and mobilize the community around this issue is make certain that everybody understands that incarceration policy affects them. Incarceration is not something that happens to someone else. Reentry isn't something that happens in another community. It affects us all. So if you think that you want to live in a safe neighborhood, if you want your children to go to quality schools, if you care about the future of the state or the country that you live in, then you need to care about incarceration rates.
Thank you, Ms. Blank.
Well, there are a lot of issues that we face in the General Assembly. I happen to be particularly interested in health care. So getting early intervention for behavioral health services is one piece of this issue that's very important to me. I think if we had some school-based health centers where we could get young people identified and get them help early before they get off track, that would be very helpful. That's just a piece of a very big puzzle. We'd like to catch them before they get in the juvenile justice system.
And secondly, what do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
Well, I think I talked about the way I think we could reduce incarceration simply by spending time with children in elementary school and middle school. Teachers, I've been a teacher. Teachers can see problems developing. It's my belief that if these children would get some early help, they would have a better chance of being successful in school and in their job, in their career, and in their family life.
Thank you very much. Youth incarceration.
The top policy or practice change that could reduce mass incarceration of youth is programs aimed at keeping them in school, utilizing community engagement, youth engagement that allows them to, instead of being disciplined out of school, keeping them in school. As many educators tell me, a child can't learn if they're not in school. So if we can have policies that are aimed at grounding young people, and even when they have to be disciplined, they're disciplining them within the school structure, it keeps them out of going down the pathway of going to jail and prison.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
Some of the best practices that I know of reducing youth incarceration are youth themselves. Youth reaching out to others, youth working as community engagement officers, working with programs like Ceasefire out of Chicago, or work that's happening in New Orleans that I'm aware of with the Silverback Society. The young people themselves are the ones who are going into the streets, talking to their peers, talking to them about staying in school, talking to them about employment opportunities. Is the most surest way to keep young people from being in trouble.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this effort?
A strategy that I would recognize that mobilizes community around youth incarceration is having the community view the young people as assets. Organizations that work with parents, organizations that work with young people, organizations working with the media to show young people as they really are, what we know them as our children, as our sons, our daughters, as our siblings. That's the way you get the community involved. They have to see them as assets and have to recognize them as their own, because that's who they are. Anytime you begin to see young people as others, you can objectify them. But making them and keeping them in within families, keeping them within communities, keeping them within schools helps us all to understand that they are our own.
Thank you, Mr. Buxton, Young Men of Color.
I think that Community Voices brings a history and a legacy and networks that are vital to raising the awareness across the nation around issues of importance to men and boys of color throughout its whole history. So that one of the things that they bring are communities and neighborhoods who are able to organize, engage, and be solutions oriented. They're evidence-based. The communities know what the issues are, and communities actually many times know what the solutions are. Community Voices has elegantly used those strategies throughout its existence, and in this particular one, their approach has been similar to the past, where they have worked with communities on what will work here. The other thing that they've done very, very well is the national import and the prevalence and the importance to the future of this nation. They're able, with their own voice, because they're known, they're credible, and they come with a lot of stature in the health, in the racial equity communities, to be able to speak credibly on the issue and be heard.
And what do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
What I think the top policy or practice is to change the situation today really is around addressing the issue of racial hierarchy and becoming aware as a nation that implicit bias figures into everything around our youth of color, from our interpretation and stereotypes, racial anxiety for whites and others, that ends up with kids incarcerated for very different reasons than many other youth in this nation. And so that raising the awareness, having a sense of what the impact of implicit bias is, whether it be in a classroom, whether it be in the courtroom, where the evidence has shown that the darker the skin tone, the more severe the sentencing guides are, or the more sentencing becomes. Can I do this again?
Yeah, take your time.
But in the, whether implicit bias, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in a courtroom, whether it's among a judge and jury, what's been shown or sentencing has been much more severe the darker the skin tone of the defendant. So we know that there are a lot of things at play here, and I think that those policies need...
I'm sorry, I apologize for stopping you, because we just had that run through, and what you were saying was brilliant, and I want to be sure it gets heard.
It wasn't brilliant, but it was just what it was.
I like what you were saying, though. It's good. It was good, though. And if you may not even remember what you were even talking about, but...
I think I was talking about the belief in racial hierarchy and then implicit bias. Is that where you want me to start? I'll probably go back to that again. I think, well, policies are informed by evidence. And one of the things that I think that Community Voices, again, because they've addressed issues of race, racism, and community engagement, that as you look at implicit bias and the belief in racial hierarchies, everything that happens in a child's life, and particularly for the young children of color, whether it be in a classroom, the implicit bias that's there in that with the teacher, with the other students, situations that get interpreted from stereotypes, racial anxiety by whites and white privilege, many times in kids of color suspended from school, and needing the guidelines that have just been passed to be fully enforced. Secondarily, what happens is in the courts and in the justice system itself, that same implicit bias enters into sentencing, so that what study and research have shown is that the darker the skin tone of the defendant, the more severe and long-term the sentence is for varying infractions that for others would be much, much less. So it is really starting to consider, as we shape policies, and you said what one policy? It would be the consideration of the impact of implicit bias and the acknowledgement and awareness, whether that's through training. I think there is enforcement of guidelines that already exist, and that may be sometimes through legal channels, but it may be in our own communities for us to be aware of our behavior and to make conscious efforts to change it.
Thank you with youth incarceration.
I look for ways that we can intervene and not allow them to be incarcerated initially, because prevention is very important. So one of the things that I look at is what services do they need to stay out of detention or incarceration. Beyond that, we look at ways of getting them back and giving them the skills to stay at home versus cycling through, as far too many do.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
We talked about the fact that they are pushed out of school, suspended too often, too quickly.
Get you to pause for just 1 second.
Yeah, we're hearing some noises in the
Oh,
background.
I see. Swallowed it then.
I'm sorry, you repeat the question again.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to address youth incarceration?
We need to keep our youth in school, and that means that schools must become more accountable. They need to track those students that they are losing and go and get them and bring them back, and they need to stop suspending students or expelling them for a year. There's nothing good out there for them, and we don't usually see them once they've been lost.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
A best practice is simply to keep them from going, and that is prevention of expulsion from school. Another is behavioral counseling, not because they are bad, but most people have things they want to work through. And many of our young people do not have a place to go and talk to and work through issues of even anger management or knowing that they have a caring system around them. And those are best practice systems. We just don't have enough of them.
And lastly, what strategies would you recommend to engage and mobilize the community in this effort?
We have to make sure that everyone understands that this is a part of their issue. I think right now most people think somebody over there will fix this. But we have to touch each person. I would say it's like lighting a candle. You have a lit candle, light someone else's candle and let them carry their decision to help someone that day who needs help. Otherwise, it stays in the hands of agencies and they just can't do it all. All of us are needed.
Thank you for incarceration.
Well, I've been, my experience in this area in incarceration is I had a career with CDC for almost 40 years. And as a public health official, I was involved in providing health care to incarcerated populations going back to the early 60s, late 70s, in jails and prisons. So my job was to go inside and to deal with issues around hepatitis, tuberculosis, TB, STDs. So I got to become very familiar with what some of the issues were for inmates as they, entered into corrections, and also the problems that they were going home with. So it became one of the things that got me very, very much involved later in my career, as I was transferred to headquarters at CDC. and became very passionate about really trying to develop public health programs that also included incarcerated populations, because they too are part of the community. And as we've heard today, everybody who's inside eventually goes home, and they go right back to where their home was, and they come back. If their problems haven't been dealt with, well, they come home with those problems.
Please share your thoughts on the role of the community in reducing youth incarceration.
As far as the role of the community, I think it's the critical niche that needs to be really dealt with, because the community has a big role, because these are their sons, their daughters, these are members of their family who are incarcerated now. They may not like them because they've done something wrong, but they are going to come home. And they're going to come home with a lot of baggage. Oftentimes they go to prison or jail at a young age, and they have very few life skills. Well, I'm sorry to say, but as we've heard today, correctional systems don't do much in the way of rehabilitation, so they're going to come home with some of the same problems they went in with, and particularly if they're behavioral problems around substance abuse, alcoholism, or mental health. They're going to need to have access to care and treatment. They're going to need the support of a family member or somebody who's going to help them navigate getting those services within the community. And if they can't come home and find a safe place to sleep, food, and have the ability to maintain a healthy lifestyle, well, their chances of staying in the community are not going to be very good. And that's why we see the constant recidivism around a lot of drug abuse, a lot of mental health issues, is that folks really can't cope unless there are going to be some supportive mechanisms. And truly, there are really not that many programs out there across this country that can provide that support. So where do we have to look? We have to look at communities to help provide that support. Without the community, it's not going to work.
And what policy changes would you like to see to reduce the high rates of incarceration?
I think the biggest thing that could be done to reduce the high rates of incarceration is to change the sentencing policy. There's no reason whatsoever that folks with substance abuse offenses need to be incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. What they need is treatment. We need to be putting those folks through diversionary courts and having them continue to work and do something productive while they're in treatment. The same thing for the folks that are that have mental health issues. Jails are not equipped to be mental health hospitals, nor are prisons. We need diversionary programs to deal with those issues. And there's a whole host of things like that should be dealt with.
Leona Barr Davenport. I'm president and CEO of the Atlanta Business League.
You're all set.
What is inhibiting minority business owners from hiring young men of color with criminal backgrounds?
When I think of what might be an inhibitor of black business owners hiring young black men who have records or who have been incarcerated, it will possibly be that when you look at small business owners, the decisions that they make as it relates to hiring and impact their business at such a high rate. If they have 4 employees, if one's gone, then that's a 25% turnover. So when you look at hiring, you're looking to get the best that you can to bring into the business in order to make your business successful. But I think secondly, I don't know that a number of young men or black men who have been incarcerated are coming to the doors to be hired. I don't know what the statistics are saying about that, but I would probably and could probably query my organization of 500 businesses right now to ask them how many young black men who have been incarcerated have come to their doors and applied for a job. And so it's difficult to gauge that, to say exactly why they're not hiring. I don't know that they're necessarily having the opportunity to do so.
And secondly, what would need to happen to ensure that there is no hesitation to hire from this population?
I think what black business owners would be more inclined to hire young black men who have been incarcerated if there was some foundation upon which they could rest. There are a number of programs in the city that allow businesses to hire an employee for 3 to 6 months to allow them to come in, get training, and they're being paid by that fund or that organization. I think a program such as that, something that, and I don't know if the word is some kind of insurance that the employer may not have to pay, might give them some sense of satisfaction because they would feel that they won't lose anything by training this young person, giving them an opportunity to work in a business and giving them that access. I think an opportunity of that nature or some type of funded initiative would help with that.
Thank you.
Warnock, W-A-R-N-O-C-K, Senior Pastor, Ebenezer Baptist Church. Yeah, so far so good, huh?
You're the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
I'm sorry I don't look the part, huh?
You do.
All right.
You're all set. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead.
In your professional role, how do you address the issue of youth incarceration?
Oh, we are focused on the issue of youth incarceration at Ebenezer Baptist Church in many ways. It is something that I talk about often from the pulpit. It's in my sermons because I do believe that this issue of mass incarceration is, as Michelle Alexander has described it in her very important book, it is the new Jim Crow. It is a huge problem in our country. And although we're talking about boys of color, it really is everybody's problem. Particularly as our country changes in terms of demographics, it's becoming a browner and blacker country. And so when we talk about what's happening to young Black and Latino boys, we're talking about what's going to happen to America as we compete globally. And so we engage this issue in many ways. I talk about it from the pulpit. We have many youth programs in our church. We have, traditional programs like the Scouts, but we also, for a while, and we're hoping to get it going again, we had a program focused on working with young people in the community who have had a brush with the law, have in some way entered into the juvenile justice system, but it's their first scrape with the law. And so our deacons actually work with them every month, and there's an enrichment program on Saturdays. We ran into a little bit of a snag. Some folks had some questions about church and state, so we're trying to get that ironed out. But it was not a program of preaching and proselytizing, but exposing them to values that everybody celebrates. Hard work, integrity, character, the kinds of things that we would instill in all of our children. So we had that program going. Our church recently pulled together a collaboration of some 4 nonprofit organizations that are all located in our church building and on our campus. And they are focused on a wide variety of issues. One is Operation Hope, and their focus is financial literacy. So they're teaching kids about credit, credit scores, money and how it works, which is a lesson that doesn't get taught enough in our schools. Casey Family Programs, which is focused on foster care, is also located on our church campus, focused on public policy, trying to keep kids from going into foster care, serving families and those who are in foster care, trying to improve outcomes for kids. We also have a workforce development program in our church that's run by the Center for Working Families, and then the Ensoro Foundation, which works with kids who've aged out of foster care to help them get into college and to succeed. So all of these nonprofits are working together in our church building called the Martin Luther King Senior Community Resources Complex. And the idea is that it is a one-stop shop focused on serving families, changing outcomes in the Old Fourth Ward community, everything from family stability to credit scores, moving people from being renters to homeowners, teaching people how to start businesses and own businesses. And we believe that this issue of how you keep kids out of the criminal justice system is comprehensive, right? It's a wraparound approach that we're after. And in addition to that, early childhood development is something that we continue to advocate for. The difference between kids who grow up in middle class or affluent families and kids who grow up in poor families, the difference is about 30 million words. And so this age between 0 and 5 is absolutely critical when the brain is literally being built and you can't get those years back. And so we continue to advocate at a public policy level to make sure that all of our kids have a chance.
What do you find to be the top policy or practice change needed to reduce youth incarceration?
Some of the policy changes?
Policy or practice changes.
Oh, I think that there are a number of policy changes that we need in order to reduce youth incarceration. Young people grow up in families, and I think the strength of those families clearly impacts the likely outcome of the children. So, you know, one of the things that we need is to give working people a living wage, which is a national debate that's going on right now. But people need to work, and work needs to pay. And one of the interesting ironies for me is that a lot of the people who are very moralistic about how important work is are the same people in our political arena who do not want to raise the minimum wage, do not support the fact that work ought to pay. So when we talk about family values, we can't talk about that in a kind of narrow way. We've got to talk about that in a broad way. We've got to give families a chance, and the children in those families, whether they're single families or two-parent families, are likely to do better. So there are a number of public policy issues. I think we've got to look to ban the box on employment applications in cities and municipalities across the state and across the country. I mean, there are many of these applications that ask, have you ever been arrested? Well, it's not very difficult for a young Black or Latino man, young person, to have had some kind of scrape with the law, to have encountered the police in some way, because of the ways in which our so-called war on drugs has been prosecuted now for 30 years and more. But in any case, when people have served their time, when they have met their debt to society, they ought to at least have a reasonable chance. And so these are some of the public policy issues that we've got to address.
Are you aware of a best practice in reducing youth incarceration?
Well, I think that when we're talking about if we're talking about best practices for reducing youth incarceration, we really have to address this at the level of public policy and laws. We've been on this kind of binge in America for 30 years and more around getting tough on crime. We need to get smart on crime. And so we wouldn't have as many young people in our jails if we did not have the tentacles, if you will, of the criminal justice system to enter so early into school systems for the slightest infraction in some of our communities. It doesn't happen in all of our communities. It happens in some communities. So these are the kinds of public policy issues that we have to address. And I think that there's room politically on both sides, on the right and on the left. There are good reasons. You know, it's not fiscally sustainable. It doesn't make sense if you're a conservative to continue to do what we're doing. If you're a liberal or a progressive, certainly this kind of a lack of investment in our most precious resource is antithetical to what we represent at our best as Americans, that we really would seek to invest in children on the front end rather than punishing them on the back end. That's no good for them, and it's no good for us.
And lastly, what role does the faith-based community play in addressing the issue of mass incarceration as it relates to young men of color?
I think that the faith community has a huge role to play in addressing this issue of mass incarceration with young men of color. A lot of the language about what's right, about morals and values, comes from the faith community. And unfortunately, in many cases, the faith community has played a role in stigmatizing people rather than having a kind of broad view that lifts people up and gives them a fair chance. And so all of this language about faith and family values, very often, you know, in the last several years and decades, it's been very mean-spirited, it's been punitive, and unhelpful. And so part of what the faith community needs to do is broaden the moral and ethical scope and begin to ask, certainly personal responsibility is important, but to talk about personal responsibility devoid of public policy, or to talk about public policy without engaging the issue of personal responsibility, is to try to fly a plane with one wing. And everybody knows you need two wings to fly a plane. And so I think very often it's not simply that the faith community has been passive on this question. Some of the ways in which we talk and preach and bring our witness to bear in the public square has very, very often been unhelpful and destructive. And so we've got to broaden the scope, morally and ethically. Let our values of mercy and grace and compassion be brought to bear on this question. Challenge our politicians, many of whom sit in our churches and in our temples every weekend, and help them to understand that we're all connected together. So that's one of the major things that I think that the faith community can do. Second, I think that the faith community can play a critical role in prison reentry. Most of the men who and women who are taken away and go into our criminal justice system, most of them will return to our communities. And many of them have children. And so if we're talking about improving the outcomes of those children, or improving the outcomes of people who left when they were children and they just went through the criminal justice system, the faith community needs to think more creatively and more cooperatively about how we can help people to re-enter into society and have better outcomes. And that's everything from providing the kind of community of compassion that congregations provide and their extended communities and networks. But it's also advocating for better public policy. The faith community should be the first to stand up and say that if we want people to be citizens, constructive and productive citizens, after having had an encounter with the criminal justice system, we cannot continue to deny them citizenship. To deny them citizenship is to deny them their personhood. And so people ought to be able to vote. People ought to have some reasonable chance at a second chance. People ought to have some path to some form of work that allows them to have a living wage, and their children really ought to have a reasonable possibility of succeeding. That's important not just for them, it's important for all of us.
Thank you, Reverend.